Yeah, I give it an 8, maybe a 9. I enjoyed watching it, but realistic, I give it a 2.
Drug lords worshipped Tony Montana. Rappers built a religion around him. That face hangs on posters in 1,000,000 bedrooms. But what if that entire legend, the swagger, the empire, the blaze of glory, is built from the exact behaviors the old Mafia considered suicidal? There was one group of criminals that never bought Tony Montana, not for a second: the Italian mob. And the man you just heard is not a film critic. He is the former underboss of the Gambino crime family, John Gotti's right hand, a man who admitted a role in 19 murders. His name is Sammy the Bull Gravano. Gravano gave Scarface an 8. The 2 was for Tony Montana. By the rules that kept Gravano's world alive for decades, Tony Montana isn't a legend. He's the kind of man you stop doing business with before he gets everybody killed. So here's the question. What actually happens to a man who lives like Tony Montana in the real world? For years, that was just a movie question. Eventually, the Mafia got to find out. Because one real Mafia boss broke the most important of those rules, he wanted the suits, the cameras, the magazine covers, and one of the men warning him was Sammy Gravano.
I wouldn't even talk to him. I wouldn't be in a room with him. I wouldn't deal with him. I wouldn't want to be friends with him. I would stay away from him.
Start with who he actually is, because the myth has almost swallowed the character. Tony Montana comes off the Mariel boats in 1980, the summer Castro opened his ports and pointed 125,000 people at Florida, among them men he had emptied out of Cuban prisons. Tony lands with nothing. No family behind him, no organization above him, no patience in him at all. He climbs through the Miami cocaine trade on pure appetite, and everything he takes, he wants immediately, and he wants it seen. The money, the mansion, the tiger on the lawn, the blimp over the city telling him the world is his. He is ambition with the brakes removed. And who was he based on? Officially, nobody. Oliver Stone invented him and named him after his favorite quarterback, Joe Montana. Franzese, reviewing the film, mentions there was talk the character came loosely from some drug dealer out of Bolivia, and in the same breath admits he has no idea whether that is true. Nobody does. Tony Montana has no birth certificate in the real world, but he does have a bloodline. The title, the scar, even the first name. All of it inherited from the 1932 Scarface, and that Tony was Al Capone. The nickname belonged to Capone before it belonged to anybody. So what Pacino is wearing in 1983 is the Italian mob's founding legend, redressed by Hollywood as a Miami cocaine story, which is exactly why the men in this video felt entitled to grade him. When the real mob watched Scarface, they were not reviewing a stranger. They were watching their own myth walking around in somebody else's body and judging how it was worn. The name on that movie is theirs. The behavior on the screen is what they spent 70 years forbidding. To understand why that earns a 2 out of 10, you need the rule book. And you need the other man who graded it. Gravano wasn't the only one. Michael Franzese was a captain in the Colombo family, and at his peak, by most accounts, one of the biggest earners the American mob had produced since Capone. He sat down and reviewed the same film. And he brought something Gravano couldn't. He was actually there. In the early 80s, Franzese was running operations in Miami and Fort Lauderdale, the exact city, in the exact years, that Scarface is set in. One judge knows the rulebook cold. The other was standing inside the real version of the movie's world while the movie was being written. Here is what makes their verdict worth hearing. They both liked it. Franzese calls it one of Pacino's best. Gravano gave the film an 8 and rated Tony himself an 8 out of 10 as a tough guy, and said that other tough guys would respect him. So this was never contempt for a movie. It is colder than that. It is contempt for a colleague's conduct. They separated the man from the behavior, and it is the behavior they buried. Now the mob was never one thing. Families differed. Cities differed. Eras differed. And rules got broken constantly by the men who wrote them. But across all of it, the men who lasted tended to agree on the fundamentals. 4 of them. Stay invisible. Stay quiet. Never touch the product. Never draw the heat. Hold Tony Montana up against those, one famous scene at a time. He fails all 4. Start with the scene nobody forgets. A rented apartment in Miami. A cocaine buy that turns into a robbery. And it is worth being precise here, because people misremember this scene constantly. Tony does not hold the chainsaw. Hector does, on Tony's friend Angel, while Tony is handcuffed to a shower rod and made to watch. Manny arrives, Tony shoots his way out, and leaves with the money. Which means the professional's question is not, why did Tony do that? It is, why was Tony in that room at all? He chose that trade. He chose a world that put him across the table from men like this. He walked into a rented apartment to do business with them, watched what they did to his friend, and then went back into the same business, with the same kind of people, and built an entire life on it. Gotti's underboss put it bluntly. That is not the Mafia. Not a version of it, a different culture entirely. And you do not have to take his word for it, because the record says the same thing. Take Roy DeMeo, whose crew ran out of a bar in Brooklyn and became the most notorious dismemberment operation in American mob history, a crew connected to dozens of killings. Even there, in the worst of it, the saw was a disposal tool. It came out after the victim was dead, in a controlled space, to make a body stop existing. What happens in that Miami apartment is the reverse. It is performed on the living, in a building full of neighbors. And that difference is not squeamishness. It is arithmetic. You do not do business in a world where a routine dispute becomes an atrocity so grotesque that every homicide detective, every newspaper, and eventually every federal agency in the state wants inside it. A body that disappears is a problem solved. A massacre in an apartment is a problem that keeps multiplying, for years, for everyone in the orbit, including men who had nothing to do with it. Tony Montana can see the next 5 minutes. He cannot see the next 5 years. Here is the reversal, though. The scene is not Hollywood excess. Stone pulled it out of Drug Enforcement Administration and Federal Bureau of Investigation case records. It happened. So the most shocking thing in Scarface is true. It just is not mob true. It belongs to a different criminal culture entirely. That is the line both these men keep drawing, and the film's whole premise sits on the wrong side of it. The second failure is faster, and, professionally, worse. Tony guns a man down in the middle of the street. Not a back room. Not a parking lot at 2 a.m. A public street, in daylight, in front of a crowd of people who can all see his face. Gravano watches it and does the math out loud, all kinds of witnesses, and it would take a miracle to walk away from that. Then he says the thing that should stop you cold, if you understand what he is actually claiming.
Problem started when he first went into that house and tried to rob people and got into the drug business and killed a guy in the middle of the street. His future was limited right then and there.
Count what Tony just handed away. Every person on that street is a potential witness. Every one of them can describe him. There is no controlled location, no window of privacy, no version of the next hour where he is not the most identifiable man in Miami. Because a professional's first question about a killing was never, "Can I do this?" It was, "Who can see it? And what exactly do they see?" Tony never asks. He cannot control the room because he never chose the room. And that is what he meant at the start of this, that he would not talk to a man like that, would not sit in a room with him, would keep his distance entirely, a man who has admitted a role in 19 murders, describing a fictional gangster as too dangerous to stand next to. Not because Tony is violent. Gravano is violent, because Tony is visible. Before the next scene, look at what an actual Mafia assassination looked like, because the pattern shows up again and again in the case files and the crime scene photographs, across decades and across families. It was patient, and it was quiet. What comes through the record is not ferocity. It is preparation. These killings happened where the men doing them had decided they would happen, at a time they had chosen, in front of as few people as possible. And the through line in those documented cases is not brutality. Paul Castellano is shot outside a Manhattan steakhouse in December 1985 by a team in position, at a chosen doorway, at a chosen minute. Sonny Black Napolitano, the Bonanno captain who unknowingly vouched for an undercover Federal Bureau of Investigation agent, is taken quietly to a basement, and his body is not found for a year. The through line is control of the setting. The ideal was that nobody heard about the work until somebody found a body. Now watch the Babylon Club. Shooters open up on a crowded nightclub. 14 people are hit, and the target walks out alive.
They're not assassins, they're not killers, they're idiots. I mean, who would do something like that?
The mob's violence was not restrained. It was controlled. Loud is cinematic. Quiet is survivable. Every gunshot in Scarface that thrills an audience is, to a professional, a confession being broadcast. But the worst rule Tony breaks is not about how he kills. It is about what he sells and what it does to him. By the third act, Tony is sitting behind a desk with a mountain of cocaine on it, face down in his own product. There was a reason much of the Mafia officially wanted distance from the drug business, and it had nothing to do with morality. Narcotics brought long sentences, informants, unstable people, and for men who started using what they sold, a different kind of problem entirely. Now, the honest version of that rule matters, because people love to point out that mobsters dealt narcotics constantly. They did. The record is full of it, and Franzese does not dodge that at all. His point is that guys were not supposed to, and that in his family, dealing drugs got you killed.
I never said that guys were not dealing with drugs. Yes, guys were doing it, but we weren't supposed to. And if we in our family dealt with drugs, we got killed. That was the bottom line.
Guys did it on the sneak. The rule was real, and it was broken, and breaking it carried a death sentence. Both things are true, and the second one is why the rule existed. You can see the same instinct in something as simple as how the money moved. In the film, Tony's cash goes through a bank's front door in duffel bags, hauled past a lobby full of people. Franzese's version, he paid a bank about $30,000 to build out its own basement as a private counting room, ran millions a week through it underground, and had the bank wire it out for him. Louder is not bigger. Quieter is bigger. But the deepest difference between Tony Montana's world and theirs was never the money. It was what the product does to the people who touch it. Franzese watched the film's storyline about Tony's sister having lived his own. His sister was addicted, surrounded by men he knew were supplying her. She died of an overdose at 27. By his own account, the worst thing he ever did in that life was in retaliation against the people who hurt her, and he says he has no regrets about it. And that is the piece the movie cannot dramatize because it is not cinematic. Which brings it back to the man behind the desk. Every other rule Tony breaks endangers the people around him. This one takes the man himself, and a man who cannot control himself cannot be controlled by anybody else either. 4 rules, 4 failures. But rules on paper are one thing. Now look at the men who actually lived by them. If Tony Montana is what losing looks like, what did winning look like? Not in the movies, in the business. And by the mob's own warped definition, winning meant one thing: staying rich, staying free, and staying out of the papers. What did the men who followed every rule he broke actually get? Start with Carlo Gambino. He was the most powerful boss in America, head of the family that still carries his name, and most of the country would not have recognized him on a sidewalk. He lived in a modest house in Brooklyn. He was rarely photographed and gave almost nothing to reporters. Federal agents understood exactly who he was and spent years unable to build a case that would hold. He ran the largest crime family in the United States for the better part of 2 decades, and in October 1976 he died the way no movie gangster is ever allowed to die. At home, of natural causes, at 74, a free man. That is what winning looked like. Nobody makes a poster of it. And be clear about what that quiet actually was. Invisibility did not make Gambino gentler. The extortion, the loan sharking, the killings all ran at full volume behind it. He was not a better man than Tony Montana. He was just much harder to photograph. Then there is the question of how far a man will go to not be seen. Vincent Gigante ran the Genovese family, by many law enforcement estimates, the strongest family in New York. And for years, he shuffled around Greenwich Village in a bathrobe and slippers, unshaven, muttering to himself, checking into psychiatric hospitals, while a generation of prosecutors argued about whether he was mentally competent to stand trial. The act held up for decades. It only came apart when men from inside his world testified that the whole thing was theater. Think about the trade he made. Tony Montana wanted the world to know his name. Gigante wanted the world to believe he had lost his mind. One of those men is a fantasy. The other ran New York. Which brings us to the strangest moment in Gravano's entire review. Because when he watches Tony Montana strut, the suits, the fame, the appetite to be looked at, he does not reach for a movie comparison. He reaches for a name. A real one. His own boss.
John Gotti was a guy who walked around all fucked in, dressed up. He wanted to be like a superstar, and that's not what we are.
And then the other half, which lands quieter and hits harder. When Gravano had money, he says, he bought a farm. For his wife. For his kids. That was the dream at the top of the most powerful crime family in America. Not the spotlight. a farm. Now look at what his boss did with the same position. And if you were an adult in the late 80s, you do not need archival footage for this, because you watched it live on the evening news. The hand-tailored suits the papers put a price tag on. The hair that never moved. The dapper Don coming down the courthouse steps, grinning into a wall of cameras, waving, signing autographs. 4th of July fireworks parties in Ozone Park for the whole neighborhood. And in 1986, Time magazine put him on the cover. The boss of the Gambino crime family, living out the one part of Tony Montana the old men feared most. And they hated it. Men inside his own family believed his style was pulling dangerous attention onto all of them, and the other families regarded it with open contempt. The Mafia never had to imagine what happened when one of its own bosses embraced Tony Montana's most dangerous instinct. John Gotti did it in public. And one man in that family, the man sitting in a review chair 40 years later, grading a movie, told him so directly and was overruled. What happened next is the entire reason those rules existed. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had been hunting the Gambino family for years. Gotti did not create that investigation. He just made it easy. Then, in January 1988, Gotti issues an order. Every captain in the family is to appear at the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street once a week, to check in, to show respect, to be seen with the boss. Gravano argues against it. What you are doing, he tells him, is marching the entire leadership of this family past federal cameras, on a schedule, and handing the government an organizational chart. He was not the only one inside the family who thought so. Gotti overrules all of them. The parade goes ahead, and he insists on all of it, including Gravano, who is in hiding at the time and has to travel in from Brooklyn to stand in a doorway and be photographed. The superstar has to be attended. And here is the part that should settle any argument about whether the underboss was right. The weekly ritual did exactly what he said it would. Agents photographed Mulberry Street week after week, and the effect on the investigation is documented plainly in the record. The Federal Bureau of Investigation came away with a near-complete list of every significant figure in the Gambino family. A secret society had put its membership on a schedule. But mapping the family was one thing. Hearing Gotti talk was another. The club was already bugged, but Gotti assumed it was dirty and kept the real conversations out of it. Then an informant told the Bureau where the real talking happened. An upstairs apartment in the same building belonging to Nettie Cirelli, the elderly widow of a Gambino soldier, a room Gotti believed was clean. Over Thanksgiving weekend of 1989, while Mrs. Cirelli was away in Florida, a surveillance team let itself in and wired it. 600 hours of tape. On them, the boss of the Gambino family discusses murders, and he talks about his own underboss, complaining, blaming, positioning the weight of the family's crimes onto the man standing next to him. They are arrested at the Ravenite in December 1990. And in the months of pre-trial proceedings that follow, Gravano finally hears what his boss had been saying about him in that upstairs room. The man he had warned, the man he had served, the man he had killed for, putting the weight on him. He flips in the autumn of 1991. He testifies for 9 days. The Teflon Don, who had walked out of 3 trials, is convicted on everything: racketeering, 5 murders, obstruction, the lot. Life without parole, no chance of release. He is moved to a federal prison in Illinois, and kept in near total isolation. And on the 10th of June, 2002, he dies of throat cancer in a prison hospital in Springfield, Missouri. And the family learned. After Gotti, they went back to being invisible. The boss who eventually took over kept so low a profile he was all but unrecognizable. The oldest rule in the book had just been proven at the cost of the entire empire. That is the answer to the question this started with. What happens to a man who lives like Tony Montana in the real world? He does not get a fountain and a blaze of glory. He gets the rest of his life in federal custody and a cancer ward with a guard outside the door. The rules did not need enforcing. They enforced themselves the way they always had. And the man grading the fantasy version a 2 out of 10 is the one who watched the real version happen from close enough to be caught in it. Which leaves one question. If the professionals graded him a dead man, why is Tony Montana the most worshipped gangster ever put on film? Because his worshippers were never the Italian mob. Scarface became scripture somewhere else. In the drug trade that exploded across America in the years right after it came out, and in the culture that rose alongside it, a world with a different rule book, where visibility was not the fatal flaw, where the flash was the entire point. The old world optimized for invisibility and longevity. The new one optimized for glory. Tony Montana was never a manual for the Mafia. He was a prophecy of what replaced it. And there is the last irony in this whole thing. The archetype started with an Italian mobster, Capone's nickname, Capone's scar, Capone's rise and fall. Hollywood took it, handed it to a new world, and half a century later, the men who had inherited Capone's business looked at what came back and gave it a 2 out of 10. 3 men, 3 endings. Tony Montana. Face down in a fountain in a mansion nobody keeps. The spectacular death, the one the posters are made from. John Gotti, who lived closest to that fantasy in real life, dead in a prison hospital with the family he had inherited in ruins behind him. And Carlo Gambino, who followed every rule Tony Montana broke, dead of old age in his own bed, still in power, still free. Gambino died in his bed. Gotti died in a cell. And the man who watched it all happen still won't put himself in a room with Tony Montana.